Hi, good evening. Thank you so much for coming out on Easter Saturday. Ted Hodgkinson, am I the only person who thinks David Tennant is looking more and more like Ted Hodgkinson every day? I did think so as he passed just now. All right, as Ted said, I'm going to be back in the second half for an extended conversation with Samira. Right now, I'm just wanting to introduce my partners and friends, both for the evening and concerning this book that we're publishing. Bianca Bagnarelli. Many of you probably have seen her images before, even if you haven't clocked her name. She often illustrates in the New York Times, and most recently she did the jacket, the cover for the kind of the prestige double issue of the New Yorker that launched at the year. They always have this special edition on the 1st of January of every year, and it was her jacket, her cover that was on the New Yorker this time. She and I collaborated 6 years ago on a beautiful Italian project, which was kind of like 50% my prose and 50% her artwork. And I've been a huge fan of hers ever since. I think she's one of the best of the younger generation of European comics artists. She comes very much from the fumetto and the French bande dessinée traditions rather than the manga tradition or the American DC Marvel tradition. I think she's a really exciting comics artist. And when we were discussing possibly doing this book, I immediately asked Faber would they approach her. So for me, it's a real thrill that she's worked on this. She's here tonight, which is terrific. I have no idea where she is, but maybe you give her. Oh, there she is. Right, this is Bianca. Well done. And you'll probably agree if you've seen some of her work, they're always poignant, compassionate, strangely uplifting, and always fun. Stacey Kent, Jim Tomlinson. Ted just made it sound like it was a very simple business of choosing their track on Desert Island Discs, and then you get a gig writing songs for them. It wasn't quite that simple. There was about a 4-year sort of audition period where I had to kind of suck up to them and be friendly and say marvelous things about their albums. I even wrote liner notes for one of Stacey's albums in that time. And this earned me this kind of boardroom meeting one day. I was called into their North London house, and there was this massive table, and there were just 3 of us sitting there with Stacey at the head of the table in dark glasses. She didn't take the dark glasses off at any time. And they put this idea to me that, they said that they made a whole series of very successful albums, but they'd all been cover versions of the Great American Songbook. And they were about to sign on for the legendary Blue Note label, and they wanted a new kind of album, and they wanted to have some original compositions for Stacey to sing. And they asked, would I think about writing the lyrics? And none of us knew whether this was going to go anywhere, but I said, yeah, right, I'll try. And there came this very interesting moment then, during this boardroom meeting. Stacey, there was kind of a pause, and Stacey said, well, there's something else. She said, you see, we know about your books. And, we're familiar with them, and they can be pretty sad, she said. And she said, that's all right. She said, that's all right, that's your business. But if you're going to write lyrics for me, she said, you can be pretty sad, but you've got to have a tiny bit of hope. Give me a tiny bit of hope. And she actually did this. She put kind of a finger and thumb right in my face, across the table. She said, even if it's only a tiny piece, a little sliver, I just need a little bit of hope there. Yeah. And I thought, well, this is a very interesting insight into the art of a great singer. But I also thought this is maybe something I could take away for my day job. I thought Just a profound thing. Okay, so that's how we started. All right, so I want to introduce, it's fantastic to introduce, Art Hirahara on piano, Jim Tomlinson on woodwinds, and on vocals, Stacey Kent. Thank you.
You say it's the way these passing years have treated you, that the weight of the dreams we once carried has now defeated you, that our candlelit dinners will all just be reheated through, our quarrels and disappointments just get repeated too. Well, I've packed our bags. I know I should have consulted you, but pretending to bargain would have only insulted you. So do just as I say. We'll go away today. The fire still burns, whatever you may claim. Let's be young again, if only for the weekend. Let's be fools again. Let's fall in at the deep end. Let's do once more all the things we did before the summer we crossed Europe in the rain. Remember that hotel, the crooked balcony door, from where we stood and watched the market in the downpour, sharing warm baguettes on sunny cathedral steps, dancing the tango, waiting for our train. Let's be young again, if only for the weekend. Let's be fools again. Let's fall in at the deep end. Let's do once more all the things we did before the summer we crossed Europe in the rain. Let's be young again, if only for the weekend. be fools again. Let's fall in at the deep end. Let's do once more all the things we did before. The summer we crossed Europe in the rain. Thank you so much.
Well, first of all, I want you to tell us about the fact that you started out writing song lyrics before you began writing fiction. But I'm going to quote a line at you from one of your short stories. This is Malvern Hills, which is in the collection Nocturnes. The young songwriter is fascinated and frustrated by songwriting. And when he auditions for various bands and they turn down his songs, he's told, "No offense, mate, it's just that there are so many wankers out there writing songs." You were very serious about songwriting to start with. How and why?
Well, that was my big passion. I mean, from around the time I was 15 to when I was about 23, 24, that was a thing I really wanted to do, and that was the art form I really believed in. I wasn't wanting to write stadium rock or anything like this. It was very much the singer-songwriter tradition of the 60s and the 70s, you know. And so it was all, you know, I did a lot of performing myself. I mean, I would stand about in back rooms of pubs and folk clubs and sing my own songs with an acoustic guitar. Yeah. And all right, you might, you know, this might sound pitiful, but looking back now, and we all try to justify these periods of our lives, I think that was my apprenticeship for the career I came to have as a writer. I often see emerging writers, young writers, going through exactly the same phases I went through, except as a singer-songwriter. And so, yes, I feel in many ways that the priorities I still have as a writer of fiction are the ones I arrived at after I made this journey as a writer of songs. And you know, I went through the intense autobiographical phase, and I went through the kind of purple prose experimental phase. But I did it all as a songwriter. So
how do you think that experience has shaped the writer that you became and have become?
Well, all right, to be honest, I mean, a lot of this is retrospective. You know, it's when I've been thinking about it, as I've got older, I've started to think, well, actually more and more of what I do and my instincts as a writer of fiction, you know, that's come from that as well. You know, just to take a few examples, you know, when you're trying to be this kind of, you know, Dylan-esque, you know, Leonard Cohen-esque singer-songwriter, the first person is very natural. Yeah. I mean, it's almost like it's a natural first-person form. And I've always been kind of stuck on first person as a writer of fiction. And I don't just mean technically first person, you know, that it goes I. I always try and create a voice between the narrator and the reader, which I think is very similar to the situation I would have found myself in when I was this adolescent, unsuccessful singer-songwriter in a darkened room, singing to about 15 people who aren't very interested. In all my books, I notice the narrator actually addresses the reader as you. And it often isn't the actual real reader. It's not the people who are really reading the book. It's some supposed person that the narrator thinks is his or her audience. And that creation of that intimate voice, it's not a shouty, I'm performing in front of a huge crowd kind of stadium rock kind of voice. It's that rather attempt to create an intimate first person. Also, if you're writing songs, have you ever tried to write a song, Samira? No, maybe. All right. So I won't.
Well, I have, but
right.
Really, yes.
Well, I mean, you might have had this experience. I mean, it's natural that because you have so few words, and you understand that the impact that you're going to have on any listener has to come largely from the other elements as well: the performance, the melody, the chord sequence, the musical context. The words are very few, and so there's a natural tendency it seems very natural to place the meaning. You don't want all the meaning to be in the actual words. You don't want the words to be self-sufficient. And certainly emotion, and that might just be me, but it feels natural to push the emotions down below the surface of the words, or maybe in between the lines.
Yes.
And so I learned to do that eventually after I went through my purple prose phase and all this kind of stuff. And that's where I arrived at as a songwriter. And I think that's where I've stayed as a writer of fiction. I've always wanted the big emotions not to be worn cleanly, on the surface, but the reader has to lean in to try and figure out what the narrator is really feeling.
There's also something about the haunting quality of your fiction and the fact that a great song lingers and in a way haunts you. That's quite an important connection you see as well, isn't it?
Yes, I think that's possibly the most important lesson. I kind of imbibed from writing songs. I mean, a song only usually lasts about 3 minutes, or sometimes as long as 6 or 6 minutes or something. But obviously, it's not designed to only work at the point of contact. The minutes that you're listening to it. The whole point of a song is that it's supposed to embed itself in the listener's mind, in their hearts, so that it has to be like a parasite, like a virus, so that when they're years later, sometimes when they're going through something, whether it's something very happy or heartbreak or whatever, that a particular song comes to mind, and it becomes important. That's how songs are supposed to work. And so it seems to me very natural that any work that you create has to have that power, that longevity of impact. And I do notice, I have to say, I've got nothing against creative writing workshops or anything like this. No, honestly, I don't. But I do notice that there's a lot of energy spent on talking about how you hold the reader's attention while they're reading the book. How you grip them and how you don't let them go. And so, I mean, it's the same in cinema as well. I'm really surprised that people don't worry more about what happens when the thing ends. Because for me, that's always a real priority. I spend, often when I'm just stuck, when I'm trying to write a novel, and I'm trying to figure it out, and I think, that's not going to work. I'm stuck for ages sometimes, and that I'm not stuck because I don't know what to do next. I'm stuck because I can't quite see how you make this material linger, days, months, years after the reader has experienced it. Because that, for me, is one of the most important things. And it always amazes me that other writers don't worry about this. Maybe it's just me. Maybe it doesn't matter. You have a great time reading the book. Forget it when you finish.
Well, I think there's a reason that your books are memorable and that you have the success you have. I mean, there's a song which wasn't performed tonight, but which is on the album, which I love. It's called In the Changing Lights, when a couple who went backpacking in their youth bump into each other years later in middle age at a street crossing. And I thought of The Remains of the Day, you know, this sudden moment of when they meet again and the regrets. Is that what these songs have in common, I think, with your fiction? This idea of time is suddenly fluid, you can be transported back to a past, and there's all the thinking about what did or didn't happen.
I guess so. I mean, it is one of the things, it's one of the tropes that of my work in general, I suppose, of perspective that time gives you. And I suppose having to accept what the years do to you and to people you love, and what the years do to relationships. Sometimes it's disappointing. Sometimes it isn't. But it's one of the things that we have to experience and accept. And that probably does happen a lot in both my fiction and in these songs. But these songs are kind of specifically written for Stacey to sing. I mean, they aren't sort of general splurges of artistic sort of enterprise on my part. I'm a kind of hired lyricist here, and I'm trying to do my job.
And crucially, she asked for hope.
Yes, I know.
Is that hard?
Well, as perhaps she was implying back in 2006 when we started this process. I mean, she was perhaps implying that it might not occur to me as obvious that you had to have hope in the mix. And as I said at the beginning, quite aside from being it's a useful remit when you're writing for Stacey's voice, because that is what is one of the great powers of her voice, as you probably heard, is that she has the ability to mix melancholy and sadness with hope and courage. She does heartbreak without bitterness, which is quite unusual in the jazz vocal tradition, I'd say. I mean, a lot of the great jazz singers are very bitter. Nina Simone, Billie Holiday. I love these singers, but they do bitterness. Stacey is quite unique in that she can do that interesting combination of, everything's falling apart, but life is still all right, and I've still got something left. And it probably has had an effect on me. My more recent books perhaps have a little bit more hope in them. I don't.
Well, there's a song you've chosen to tell in discs. Was it her performing a version of Gershwin's "They Can't Take That Away from
Yes.
You"? So that's interesting, isn't it? That seems to reflect what you've just been saying about there being more to it than melancholy or darkness. And you see a link to one of your books, don't you, from that song?
Well, it's not just a link. When I chose this track on Desert Island Discs, we're talking about this song, "They Can't Take That Away From Me," which actually comes from, it's a Gershwin song that was written for a Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers movie called "Shall We Dance?" But the thing that they can't take away from the singer is memories. Everything else is, they're parting, everything else is leaving and going. But the singer is finding consolation in the idea that at least these very precious memories cannot be taken away. And when I chose that track, I had no idea at that point, but soon afterwards, I started to write my novel, Never Let Me Go. And that was one of the few instances when I had a particular line and a particular emotion that I was aiming for all the way through the book. This has happened on a number of occasions. I have
and it was that line?
It was that line and that sentiment. Yeah. Not specifically the the diction, not the actual words, but what it meant, that emotion. I did an event with David Mitchell, the novelist, at the Royal Festival Hall a few years ago, and live on stage we had this kind of realization that we had completely different approaches to the ending of novels. Because he said, he was flabbergasted. He said, how can you possibly write a novel when you actually know exactly where you are going, where you want it to end? And I was equally flabbergasted. I said, well, how can you possibly write all this stuff, not know where you're going? I don't think we're talking necessarily just about plot, but I always have to have the emotion that I'm going to land on. And that shapes the entire novel. I mean, that's the case with all the novels. And sometimes I get the landing pad, sometimes from a film or just an idea, but in this case, they can't take that away from me. I thought, yes, this is going to be a sad story about that somebody, the main character, because of, I'm not going to tell you the story, but because of who she happens to be, the situation she happens to be in, she's going to lose everything. The people most precious to her. But what she says at the end is that, the one thing they cannot take away from me are the memories. And I knew that, if you like, that's the little bit of hope. I mean, you might not even call it hope, but, the little bright thing. That was what I was aiming for, that little mixture of courage and sadness. And often, I mean, there's another Leonard Cohen song, a line that I used twice to aim at in novels. I don't know if you know much of Leonard Cohen, but there's a song called I Can't Forget, which is on his I'm Your Man album. And there's a line in that goes something like, I've loved you all my life, and that's how I want to end it. And I thought that's an interesting line, and that was once again, that emotion was what I aimed at, both in Never Let Me Go and a later novel of mine, The Buried Giant. So there are instances, where I think my kind of love affair with songs have given me tools or given me a map of what to do and what to aim for.
There's one other song that you particularly mentioned, a Tom Waits song.
Oh yeah, well, I've talked about that in elsewhere. I mean, but people might be bored if they've heard of this thing already, because I wrote about it in my Nobel lecture, as one does, I mean, it is very relevant, pertinent here. So I will. Forgive me if you were at my Nobel lecture in Stockholm. My novel, The Remains of the Day, which I was kind of coming to the end of writing in 1988. I thought I'd finished it, and I was going to hand it in, and then I listened to a Tom Waits album, and there was a song on it called Ruby's Arms. Right. I mean, it's not one of his really famous ones, but you should listen to it. It's Tom Waits, not from his kind of weird avant-garde, kind of Brechtian kind of phase. It's when he used to sing these kind of big, syrupy ballads, with his kind of gargly voice. And Ruby's Arms is a song it's a fairly simple song about, I think, a soldier who's kind of leaving his lover very early in the morning. And she's asleep in the bed, and he's sneaking out. And he's getting his rucksack, and he's going to get on a train, he's going to leave. It's a fairly standard story. But I heard Tom Waits singing. Now, Tom Waits, as you know, he's got this very macho, gravelly voice. And it sounds like the voice of a man who spends all his time pretending he has no emotions at all. He's rough and tough. He's a hobo, and he will not admit to things. But it's the voice of such a guy who is leaving this woman he loves, and he's going off on the train early in the morning in the rain. And then suddenly there's this line where this voice growls out that his heart is breaking. And I thought that's very interesting, because I've just written this novel. It's the entire novel, not in the voice of a gravelly hobo, but a very buttoned-up English butler who will not really admit even to himself that he has emotions. And this armor, if you like, it stays on all the way to the end. And I listened to Tom Waits doing his kind of hobo version of a man who pretends he's got no emotions. And yet, there's this little crack, and he starts talking about his heart breaking. And I thought, well, maybe I've got to change things. Even if it's only just once, I've got to show the reader the turmoil, the emotional turmoil that's underneath that very straight-laced surface, And so I went back and did a little bit more work. I knew that I had to be very, very careful, just as Tom Waits, I'm sure, was. But you don't want for the whole thing to become sentimental, But just that small chink in the armor, where the real emotions that have been held down, can be peeked at. Yeah. So that was a very useful experience. There are many more, but that's enough. I mean, that's the kind. Yeah, I mean, I've had a very intimate relationship with listening to singers and my songwriting, and it's an indelible part of my writing.
It's an interesting coincidence, isn't it? You've won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and so has Bob Dylan. And a question that's coming from Faye is, winning a Nobel Prize is a truly remarkable achievement, particularly for an artistic endeavour. Has winning one changed you in any way, or changed the way you approach your work?
Well, I like to think it hasn't changed the way I approach my work. I've been privileged to meet, since I won the Nobel Prize, I've been privileged to meet other Nobel Prize winners. And most of them are scientists. And so one of them who's become a good friend, Venki Ramakrishnan, who won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry some years back, he told me, well, amongst scientists who win, amongst scientists, there's this thing called the Nobel genius syndrome. And so what happens is that, a scientist wins the Nobel for this kind of superb piece of work they've done in a very narrow field. And they win the Nobel Prize, and they believe that they're a genius and that they can pronounce on all these other fields of science. And they embarrass themselves, by publishing papers and in all these other fields. And people think, well, he doesn't know what he's talking about. So I was warned about this Nobel syndrome, this genius syndrome. And I think, all right, I think there's a kind of equivalent that can happen to writers who win the Nobel Prize. You think you're some kind of genius, and whatever you turn your hand to is going to be worthy of the attention of the world.
I look forward to you publishing your papers on chemistry.
No, but I mean literary endeavours, So it's,
I know.
But you don't know. I mean, I might be a great physicist.
Looking forward to it. So here's a question that's come in from Juan Guilmar Baldoni. Your book titles, like Never Let Me Go, are both simple, profound, and aesthetically beautiful, reminiscent of old popular jazz singles. Could you elaborate on your approach to selecting these titles? That's a good question.
That's a very good question. And, well, I mean, this probably isn't acceptable, but look, I mean, for about 30 or 40 years, right, this is about the time I've been with Lorna, my wife. Okay, I'm not complaining about that. And all that time, one of the things that we've done is that we've collected titles. Yeah, I mean, the title for this volume. I mean, we collected so many. Yeah.
Has that been hanging around for some years, waiting for the right?
No. That one, that's the title of one of the songs. I mean, that's a sensible thing to do in the end, But we just, if we're talking and we come across, we just say something that might be a good title, or actually all right, I'm sorry to admit this, but we actually have this thing where we open a book at random. It could be like a cookery book or anything, and you stick your finger. You mustn't look.
Okay.
And then you look to see what phrase you're pointing at. And you do this about 30 times, then you come up with about 5 titles.
I'm now thinking, was the remains of the day the soup of the day originally?
That's very good. I can't quite remember where the remains of the day came from, but I mean, so generally, I think titles have to have 2 functions. Good titles have to have serve a double function. I think they have to have a shop window function, right? So that the title, you think, oh, what a cool title, and but the other function is that when the person is reading the book, watching the film, listening to the song, something falls into place. The title helps something focus and fall into place. A theme, perhaps, or an atmosphere or an emotion. And so it's got to do both of those 2 things. It's quite difficult to get both things. One of the things I sometimes do is, so you end up with this kind of list of great titles that don't have any works to go with them, right?
Is there a long list? Have we got a list?
Yeah. There's some great. I mean, there's some that I've been wanting to bring into use for 30 years.
Excellent.
Like the scene of a strange battle. That came about when we opened Vargas Llosa's the War of the End of the World, and went like this, and I said, "The scene of a strange battle." I thought that would be a great title. Or maybe you don't think so.
No, I do. I'm trying to imagine the book to go with it.
But I have to admit, sometimes I've got the title because it's a near match to a story or a book for which I don't have a title, and I think if I just tweak that scene a little bit, and just have one of my characters utter this line, then I could use this great title. But that title never let me go. It's actually it's a stolen one, right? It's a famous song. It's like a jazz standard.
Yes.
But also, I think what's interesting about it is, and what struck me about it is that it's an impossible request. You can ask someone to kind of hold on to you for a long time. That's reasonable. But never let me go is impossible. Because something is going to part you. And so that's why I think it's such a powerful thing to ask for. Because you fully understand why somebody would ask for that and why somebody would want that, even as they understand that it's utterly impossible. And all right, Stacey, she needs this bit of hope. I mean, to work with. I like that. I often work in that little bit that you understand why human beings really want this thing, why they need it, why they ask each other or ask God or whatever about it. But at the same time, they understand that it's impossible. I often find that area a really powerful one to work in.
Yeah. Right, another question that seems to flow from what you've just said. This is from someone called Jack Wilde. Not the actor Jack Wilde, I'm guessing. I find it tempting to draw a parallel between some free-form jazz structures and your dreamscape novels. The kind of connection between myth-telling and performance of jazz standards. Are you personally conscious of the similarities between these art forms when writing, whether it's novels or song lyrics? And if so, do they influence your approaches?
Only in a very general sense. I'm nowhere near the standard of these guys that you were listening to earlier, but I have played instruments all my life, and when I try to improvise, it's not like when I write that kind of, that end of my writing. The paradox about improvising, certainly with jazz music, is that you actually need a very clear structure, a clear remit. Maybe not for some kinds of avant-garde stuff, but I mean, as far as amateurs like me are concerned, it's because you become very familiar with the structure, usually the chord sequence, that you create a space for yourself to improvise. But you've got the safety of that structure. Yeah. Now, what I've just said is actually not that different to how many novelists, write quite relatively conventional novels, and my more conventional novels are rather like that. When we write novels, we tend to have a map of where the story is going, where the emotions are going, but we wouldn't want to have everything planned out beforehand. When we're, if you like, we have to leave an element of improvisation day by day. When we get to that point in the story, we know roughly what we're trying to achieve, but you hold back from filling in too many details until you actually get there and you're writing the actual prose, And that process to me is close to what I understand. I'm not an authority at all on improvising in jazz, but that's how I understand improvising in music tends to work. It's because you have because you have a map and a diagram of sorts, that paradoxically you've got the freedom to improvise. And I think that's a kind of a happy way to write novels, not necessarily kind of things that look weird or experimental, but any piece of fiction. I think you have that. I know that some people just go straight in with a blank page and they don't know what they're going to do, page to page. But I think most people have an idea of a story in the frame. And so the more kind of weirder stuff that perhaps Mr. Wilde is referring to there, I don't think that has much to do with jazz. It has more to do with dream for me. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think it's the idea that your storytelling taps into something more ancient. So much great literature going back to Anglo-Saxon times and in other cultures too is about loss and about the kind of the human soul trying to make sense of its very short existence. The sparrow flying through the kind of great hall, and it's the idea that even the modern jazz standards that Stacey and Jim's work is very much in the tradition of. It's quite a short tradition. It's only 100 years old, but it's also so well established that there seems to be a sort of symmetry and a sympathy between the way that you tell stories and the way that they sing these songs. They connect to something bigger.
Yeah, well, I think one of the interesting things about what you might call a jazz song or the great American songbook songs,
yes,
is that they were written for a dramatic context, in the way that many songs in the rock and roll era, say, have not. Many of the Gershwin or Jerome Kern songs or Cole Porter songs, Irving Berlin songs, were written specifically for cinema, or they were written for Broadway musicals. And they were written for a character at a certain point in the story to go from normal drama into this kind of heightened thing of singing a song. And they would express what's happening to them, or their feelings about what's happening to them, in almost like a compressed, expedited way in this song. And so they are almost ready-made for the creation of character and a dramatic narrative context. And so it's quite suitable for somebody from a kind of a novelistic background to work in that jazz song idiom, as opposed to say like a Bob Dylan idiom, which seems closer to poetry to me. Because it's about story, and it's about character and it's about narrative.
I briefly met Bianca, who's done these wonderful illustrations for the book, and she said she was listening to the music constantly while working on these illustrations. And there's questions come in from Laura Folger about the fact that you've been involved with film, books and music, and what other media might you explore in the future. And I think it's the idea that the way that you work seems to flow across different formats, whether it's songwriting or filmmaking or fiction in prose. And, you know, it's interesting that there are no boundaries on your writing. Is that how you see it? And are there any other arenas you've planned to take it into?
I think there are quite a lot of boundaries. I mean, I have great limits to my abilities, and there are many things that I wouldn't attempt. But within my kind of little patch, I don't really feel that, you know, I can. Let's put it this way: I feel sometimes that, you know, a particular story, if somebody said, "Oh, you're not allowed to write it as fiction on the page," you know, I wouldn't just say, "Oh, then that's the end of that." Then I would say, "Oh, in that case, I'll see if I can do it in a song or in a film." I mean, you know, increasingly these days I've worked quite a lot in cinema. And so I don't really think of something being confined to a particular genre or to a particular form necessarily. But once you start to work in that form, you've got to be very sensitive to how that particular art form works. But where I do feel there's a huge kind of boundary, it's not so much between, say, writing fiction, writing cinema, writing songs. For me, the big border is between solo creation and collaboration. And when I'm writing a novel, I'm just writing on my own. When I'm writing for the screen, or if I'm writing song lyrics for Stacey, so that I'm working with Jim Tomlinson, I have to create from a different part of me altogether. To me, experientially, it's very different. You can't go about it in the same way. It's a different kind of creative impulse, I think, and because you can't, you know, you won't get anywhere if you just say, "Look, I'm going to do my thing here, and then you do your thing, and we'll join them up." I mean, that doesn't work. You've got to really focus on the other people you're collaborating with, and ask, you know, what do they have that's unique? You know, what is it you can provide for them that will really bring out their great strengths? You know, and when I wrote the screenplay for Living, I started from the beginning, thinking I'm going to write this thing for Bill Nye. And all the way through, I just thought about Bill Nye as an actor and what to do. You know, I wasn't really thinking about myself, and I think that I find that quite exhilarating, and I think it's quite good for me as well, because you know, I can get very monomaniacal and egotistical when I'm writing novels. It really brings you out of yourself, and I'm sure these musicians would tell you, when you're playing with other musicians, you got to, you know, the ability to listen to the people playing with you is all important, because you're trying to create this other thing between you, you know. And so I find that to be the huge difference. It's not the difference between writing for film and writing for books or whatever. It's that, you know.
It's interesting that Bill Nye is an actor who, there's a huge amount of craft that goes into his work, but so much of the performance looks effortless. It's what's not there, or you don't see it there. It's between the lines in a way. I had one other question before we bring Jim and Stacey on to talk with us, which is about the fact that this whole collection of songs is a celebration of traveling. And I know that during the COVID pandemic, there was a lot of, people really missed the fact that we couldn't travel. But equally, as you'll know, we're speaking in a time of climate emergency. There's a lot of anxiety that wasn't there 30 or 40 years ago about traveling across the world and tourism. And I wonder how far you reflect on the fact that traveling isn't the kind of carefree Frank Sinatra, come fly with me idea that in a way we still think of.
I think that's a very important point. It's a very good point. I mean, it's not just about traveling, but how, the work we create does change, according to the context of the times and what we're worried about. I think on that specific point about travel, I think travel is so ingrained in our artistic expressions. I think there's something about traveling that, as an expression of yearning for new things, or for the sorrow of exile, the necessary parting because you have to go to war, or because you have to go somewhere to earn money, and you can't do it. You have to leave your loved ones. Traveling to go back to the past, to try and reconcile with the past. And the big one, travel as a metaphor for our journey through life, from birth to death. I think it's so ingrained in the way we think about things. I think, when human beings first started to tell stories and sing songs to each other, I bet you travel figured in them. I mean, the Odyssey is one of the great works about, a smashed-up war veteran, traveling to try and get home to a home he suspects isn't going to be very good. So I don't think we're going to. Well, in any case, I don't think we're going to get to net zero any faster by cutting back on our artistic references to air travel.
I think you're not right about it.
No, but I think you're right. We do have to be. Perhaps we should be more conscious. I mean, I'm just trying to think of. Tomlinson and Ishiguro songs tend to celebrate trams and trains, I have to say, rather than air travel.
True.
As you can see.
True.
However, I'm just trying to think of planes in popular song. And actually, I don't think aeroplanes have really caught the imagination of songwriters in the way that trains and the car and boats have, in popular song. I can't really think of many plane songs. A line that, in fact, there's a Vernon Duke song from the 1920s, which is kind of jazz standard, called I Can't Get Started, which opens with the guy boasting about all the fantastic things he's done. Do you know this? The opening line is, I've flown around the world in a plane. I've settled revolutions in Spain. The North Pole I have charted, but I can't get started with you. Do you know this? That wouldn't, for various reasons, that wouldn't be a great boast today. Not least because he starts off boasting about all these air miles. But I'm thinking of other songs like Early Morning Rain, which is Gordon Lightfoot's song from the 1960s, which I like to think is about a migrant worker who hasn't got the money to go back, and he's watching all these planes take off from an airport, and he's thinking they're going to fly over the place he comes from, where his family are. I think it's a beautiful song, and there's "You Belong to Me," a Joe Stafford jazz song, which has the line. Fly the ocean in a silver plane, see the jungle when it's wet with rain. But just remember, till you're home again, you belong to me. And it's about a spouse who's been left behind, and the partner is traveling around, and she's all right about that, or maybe it's a he, but she fears that their love is not big enough, perhaps, to compete with all the things, all the riches that the wider world can offer. I think there are so many. I mean, when you come across planes in song. They express so many things that I think it's going to be quite, modes of transport, They're not really just about traveling.
No,
They express such a range of deep emotions. But I think you're right. I mean, these things change as time goes on.
Well, maybe that's part of the poignancy of some of the ideas of this song, this couple in middle age reminiscing about the romantic travel of their youth when it was carefree in all kinds of ways, perhaps an existential way too. Let's bring back on Stacey Kent and Jim Tomlinson to join us. Welcome.
Hello.
Hello, and thank you for that magnificent performance.
Thank you so much.
I also enjoyed you going... we enjoyed the slight tension of you going off-piece slightly with are they or aren't they going to perform this extra bit? What's happening on stage in front of us in this relationship?
That happens on every show.
Excellent. You talked about your discussions with Kazuo about the importance of hope. Tell me about the process from your point of view of working together. Like, were there lyrics where you said, I can't sing that?
No, not at all. To go back to the very beginning, it's not that I'm a fatalist, but this feels very meant to be. When I found out that Ish was a fan of my music, and this is early on, and so I wasn't the developed singer that I am today. But there's a clear connection as to why Ish writes so well for me and why I slot so well into them, and the two of them together with that push-pull that I was talking about. Not to get too personal, but just to go back to the very beginning, when I was a little kid, I had kind of a sad childhood. It was a sad little thing for specific reasons of things that went on in the family, and also because I was a kid with existential angst. I mean, quite literally, my mother would play the piano and she'd finish playing, and I would be left in the living room alone, and I would sit under the piano. This sounds very dramatic, but it was very quiet. And I would go, what if there was nothing? What if there was nothing?
What if there was nothing?
What if there was nothing? And I would just, I'd erase the house and the street and the school and peel things away until there was just nothing. That's very dark for a little kid. So, and yet, the human condition is to find hope. I was a mix of a dark, sad, intense little girl who was also very full of hope, sort of the cockeyed optimist. And I think that's why I gravitated towards the music that I gravitate towards in the Great American Songbook, because Ish is talking about the drama in the films. If we go back even earlier, a lot of these people are immigrants. There's a collective memory. There's a collective sadness.
Yes.
Right? And so even if I'm not inheriting my own sad story, although I did have one, it was already there embedded. And I was attracted to that kind of music because I think that I felt that. And I watched a lot of movies growing up, a lot of movies. This is another thing that we found the three of us had in common, is that I grew up on these things where if we take Rodgers and Hammerstein, I find that a really good example, because those, everybody knows The Sound of Music and Oklahoma and South Pacific, they're incredibly intensely sad, tragic stories. And yet we sing, we're happy. We find a way to sing our way out of disaster. So when Kazuo Ishiguro, this novelist whose work I loved, picked They Can't Take That Away From Me, which I also thought was such an apt choice, because a lot of people sing in my genre, in our genre. They sing this as an up-tempo kind of a number, the way you wear your hat. I never could do that. I gravitated, in this kind of vacuum sort of way, right into that very sad center of it. Whatever happens, and you two just spoke about this, and we talk about this all the time. By the way, I never admitted that whole thing about the whatever there was nothing to except to Jim. That's the first time it's out in the open. Whatever happens in the world, I still have this hope. And you also talked, the two of you, about the continuation and after the novel. And here's another reason I think that this works so well. For me, I always said to Jim, there's an ellipsis, there's a ... at the end of every one of these songs. And they linger for me as the storyteller, as the protagonist and the storyteller, which is there's this to be continued. And even if it ends in this bleak place, this protagonist is going to find her way out of this somehow. And why this now goes to you, the rhythm of it. Everything you said is so resonant, because even about the train travel, and I was thinking immediately about the sound of a train. You can't, that's not evocative on a plane. What does it do? It just goes whoosh, and then it's quiet up there. But on the train, you're constantly aware of your travel, right?
The rhythm.
And the rhythm. And that's in the music, and that's in the rhythm of the lyric. And I think that's why I've completely forgotten what the question was.
No. Well, you don't need a question. This is great. It's like a riff. I wanted to ask two things in one, and maybe, Jim, your thoughts as well on this, which is the song Postcard Lovers. It sums up just what you were saying, Stacey, about the ellipsis at the end. There's a whole story about the past between these two, but there's also where she might be going. And I wondered if you wanted to talk a bit about that, and also perhaps tell us about the song you're going to perform, which is the Ice Hotel.
Sure. Postcard Lovers is actually a song that we've recorded twice. We recorded it, kind of wrote it under time pressure, which Stacey and Ish will attest to, that I don't write under pressure well. That's like all of my songwriting collaborators, and I don't have many, probably for this reason, is that they require enormous amounts of patience, because I will be handed lyrics, and 10 years later I'll present a song, a finished song, or we'll go into the studio. But Postcard Lovers we recorded for a live album that we did in Paris. And I always felt like I left a little on the table with that song. And so for our latest album, we went back and I sort of finessed it, a little more than finessed it, but I kind of kept the heart of the song and tied up all the loose ends that I felt I'd left. But one of the things working with Ish's lyrics and writing for Stacey, and this certainly wasn't intentional, but in preparing for this event, I just did a brief survey of what we'd done, and as sad as Ish's lyrics are, and bearing in mind that they have this much hope, the trope in music is obviously if you're writing something sad, you write it in a minor key, and I'm not going to get any more technical than that. But as sad as Ish's lyrics are, all of the songs that I've written with Ish are in major keys. And I think there's something about writing sad music in major keys that works especially well for Ish and Stacey singing Ish's lyrics. And then the song that we're going to close out with is the first lyric that Ish wrote for us, and it's not a sad song. I'll say this. It's complex, emotionally complex, and it's slightly comedic, but I'll leave Stacey to sort of describe the song and the circumstances of that.
Just before you do, Stacey, I wanted to ask, Ish, would you respond to that point about the fact that the songs are all in a major key, even if there's sadness in many of them?
Yeah, well, you see, I went through a phase when I was quite obsessed with sad music. I have to admit, I was working on a project called The Saddest Music in the World. It was a movie. And I went to places like the National Archive here in London. I would say that, could you please play me the saddest music you've got on the archive? And they'll bring me all these songs, which were minor key songs from some island where there'd been famine and terrible things had happened, and the music had come out of this, and there were these kind of Irish laments and all this. And I had limited amount of time, so I had to keep saying after a few minutes, sorry, that's not sad enough. Could you bring on next? And from that experience, this might parallel what you're saying. I mean, I did conclude that I thought the saddest musics were the musics that, as you said, were trying to leave behind the sadness. So why blues music is often, blues music is played by African-American musicians. It tends to be so powerful is because it's people who are having a difficult, often tragic life. And just for a moment, they're trying to leave it behind. The music is happy, it's celebratory. The same with Irish dance music. It's music that is trying to leave behind the sorrow, but there's still little tinges of it come through nevertheless. I find that the most kind of, that's for me the saddest music. And I think that kind of chimes in what you're saying. I find most minor key songs don't sound sad at all, really. A minor key always sounds rather flamenco and, all along the watchtower. They're not, they're kind of meaty and they're kind of bruisey, but they're not, for me, they're not sad, No. Greensleeves is a minor key. It's not particularly sad, it's beautiful and very period.
What is the saddest piece of music in the world, then? I'd love to know what you found.
Well, I think it's, actually, I think it's Irish dance music. Yeah. But I mean, we all have our different views on this. You're probably going to say it's this Brazilian, the saudade stuff.
Well, yeah, I think that what's interesting here, though, is about how you're caught off guard. When it's minor, it's minor. It's kind of what we're talking about when reading a Kazuo Ishiguro novel, right? You're not being bat over the head, being told that this is very sad. It's when it grabs you when you least know it's about to grab you, in between those lines. There's so much going on in between the lines. And so, yeah, I think that story of saudade, and the Brazilians do this so well, that feeling of longing, but they can do it with a smile on their face.
Wow.
It's a quiet, sad intensity that I think we
Speaking of
gravitate
doing something with a smile on your face, tell us about the Ice
About the Ice Hotel? The reason we wanted to close out with this one is because this is so magnificent. When we first sat down, the three of us, well, there were four of us because Lorna was with us too, and had this idea to work together, we didn't know at that point where we were going with this. This was just some fun idea between friends, really. We had no big plan that 18 years later we would be here with this magnificent book. And, we started to talk about the language that would come out of my mouth that would be a modern woman in today's world, not a pastiche of the Great American Songbook, although grabbing from those elements. Anyway, the conversation got very intense very quickly and very interesting. And we talked about the language, not just because of the sense of the story, but because of the poetry of the sound of the words. Because sometimes I'll pick a song just because I love the sound of the words. They just feel great in the air, And so Ish wrote, we're talking about this, and we don't quite know how we're going to go. But he was very excited, I guess, very quickly, and he sent 2 songs by mail, not by email in those days. We got a letter in the mail. We were living in London at the time, and I will never forget this. It's a very powerful memory. I got this envelope. I went to get the mail early in the morning, and I opened up the envelope, and there are the lyrics to the Ice Hotel and Breakfast on the Morning Tram. And I cannot tell you what that feels like to open up this envelope, so it's tangible, it's physical too, and read these 2 lyrics. Jim was still upstairs, and I'm shouting to him to come downstairs so that I can read these aloud to him. And that's how it all began, because like I said, we didn't know if we were going to go with lyrics. We thought we'd start with the lyrics because that was going to make, there's not enough time for this, but that was going to make the structure of the song more interesting rather than Jim write in the formula of a Great American Songbook song. Anyway, I'm reading these aloud, and Jim said, I hear it. I hear the song. I hear it from your delivery of it. They're not poetry, they are songs, but they have to be born at some point, obviously. But I suppose the way in which I read it was in this very sung melodic way. And Jim heard the scansion and just away we went. So that...
I'm just conscious of time.
Yeah, all right, we'll go play it?
Yeah, let's
okay.
And we'll bring Art back on as well. Thank you. And while Jim and Stacey are going over and to play this, I wanted to just take the opportunity to point out that after this, Kazuo Ishiguro will be signing books in the foyer just outside the auditorium. They'll be selling copies of his books as well as this particular one. There'll also be some CDs of the album. And if people could be mindful of how many others might be waiting to have their book signed. But it's an opportunity to thank Art, to thank Stacey, to thank Jim, and especially to thank Sir Kazuo Ishiguro for this very special evening. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Let's you and me go away to the Ice Hotel. The Caribbean's all booked out, and that's just as well. Once I'd have been much keener on Barbados or Antigua, but just now I think the Arctic will suit us well. Let's you and me go away to the Ice Hotel. They've built it all with ice that's pure and clear. The sofas, the lobby, even the chandelier. The thermostat guarantees a steady -5 degrees. What other place could serve our needs so well? Let's you and me go away to the Ice Hotel. Romantic places like Verona or Paris, they'll always lead you astray. You'd have to be a novice to ever trust Venice and those dreamy waterways, and what the tropics can do. I know only too well. So let's you and me go away to the Ice Hotel. Heavy clothing at all times is the expected norm. Even candlelight at dinner is considered too dangerously warm. And when the time comes for us to sleep, we'll spread out our reindeer fleece and curl up together on an ice block carved for two. But then in the morning, provided we've made it through, we'll step out together to watch the sunrise over that vast expanse of gold. And who knows, if we're lucky, we may find ourselves talking of what our future may palace made of ice. Let's you and me go away to the ice hotel. The Bahamas are all booked out, and that's just as well. I don't think we're quite ready for Hawaii or Tahiti, and when we will be only time will